So thanks for the last, one of the last talks of the day. Appreciate it's been a long day, and I'm going to throw lots of graphs and data at you, so thanks for this. This is a bit of a sort of summary of what AGF have been doing over the last year, sort of the data we've captured over the last year with all the assessments, to try and get some insights into general trends and benchmarks, as well as some insights in what we've been doing in terms of looking at average carbon footprints and sustainability trends. So hopefully you're all some sort of aware of AGF and the assessment we do, looking at assessing sustainability across events in quite a holistic way. So power, water, waste, but also looking at biodiversity, governance, and sort of the wider aspects of sustainability. This is a bit more of a quantitative data, so we'll be looking maybe more at the sort of hard stuff and less at the sort of biodiversity and sort of community aspect. But we kind of, we realize through the assessments, we have a lot of data and we sort of capture a lot of information. It's quite good to see trends and try and set certain benchmarks, I guess, for events and for the industry. This is a work we did last year, which is the main, I guess, title of this, which is this talk, which is the carbon footprint of festivals. This was a study we did last year, looking at the sort of overall average footprint of where emissions happened for festivals. The huge caveat with this result was it's an average across a wide variety of festivals. So as you can see, audience transport is the big one, but what we did find was the huge impact of food and drink. And that was something we wanted to explore a bit more this year, and I'll show this sort of update where we're able to go into a bit more detail, particularly regarding the types of festivals. So like I said, this is an average. Big caveat is that it sort of doesn't differentiate the various types of events. But what it did show, and what we did start to capture while working with events, was actually the huge impact of food and drink, which before was maybe less captured as such because it wasn't part of the sort of traditional and also easier to gather data such as power, waste, water. Food and drink has been something that's quite tricky in terms of carbon emissions, but working with events, we were able to capture quite a lot of data on that. And as an average, it tended to be the second largest source of emissions at an event, generally always behind audience travel. And that's simply because at a festival, you'll have a lot of drink consumed. You'll also have a lot of food, particularly camping events, and particularly the difference between meat and vegetarian festivals, for example, is quite clear. So I mentioned food and drink is, on average, we found was the second biggest, always behind audience travel. But with variations, obviously, depending on the type of event, so depending on the nature of the festival, what the target audience is, and obviously where the festival is located. So this year, we're able to sort of dive a bit deeper into sort of differentiating that average into types of festivals. And this is sort of the result we find. Again, these are averages. But then in yellow, you can see this audience transport. So this is always the biggest source of emissions. That's, I think, a given, the huge impact of transport. But across all the types, except for, we had quite a lot of island-based festivals this year, and that increases the sort of transport impact of artists as well. But across all the types, really, food and drink is the second or third largest source of emissions. We differentiate, so weekend camping festival is the typical festival, so a 3 to 4 day event. There were some week-long festivals, but we didn't include those in the averages. But this sort of shows the really big aspect, the impact of food and drink. Sorry, I did this presentation in the midst of all the organizations, so that's quite... Interestingly, this year we had a lot more festivals who went fully vegetarian and fully vegan, which allowed us to kind of show the impact of festivals that serve meat versus those which have removed meat from their site. And as you can see, there is a huge impact across your sort of footprint. So instead of being maybe 25% of your footprint on average, it goes down to maybe being 10 to 12%. So removing red meat or removing meat from a festival's site, or working with traders to try and remove meat, or work with traders who sort of serve a lot less red meat, for example, does have a huge impact on the sustainability of your event. And this is quite, we're sort of working with a lot of festivals to look at this, and especially how you communicate with traders to get this aspect. And we've noticed a lot of festivals as well working with things like Climato and other sort of organizations who help communicate and label, the food and the sustainability of the food you serve. So that's been a really interesting trend. And this year, about 8% of the festivals we assessed were fully vegan or vegetarian, which is quite a lot more than before. Generally, there was always 1 or 2, and this year there was 5 to 6, which is quite a big increase overall. In terms of general trends, nothing too surprising. If we look at urban festivals versus more sort of rural festivals, it's, as you would expect, obviously rural festivals have more car travel. Not necessarily a bigger carbon footprint in terms of transport, though. Camping festivals, which take place in sort of more rural locations, sometimes have a much smaller footprint overall in terms of transport, mainly because you'll have people staying on site or attract a more local audience. And sometimes, well, quite frequently, urban events will sometimes have a higher footprint because maybe they have a bigger a lot more people will come to it, and from further away. You might have people fly to London, fly to Paris, whereas if you're taking an event in the middle of rural Wales, you might drive from a more local area, for example. The next few slides will be sort of trends across sort of resource use that we found from the assessment. So this is water use. The average across all events we assessed was about 16 liters per person per day. As one would expect, camping festivals have a much higher water use from non-camping festivals. This is quite different from the Show Must Go On report in 2020 from Julie's Bicycle. I think found that their benchmark for camping festivals is about 14 liters per person per day. So we've seen this is quite significantly higher than that. The Show Must Go On report was based, I think, was pre-2020. So part of it could be based on the types of festivals we assess. There might be sort of earlier stages in their sustainability journey, but also there's been an increase in the amount of festivals who provide sort of free refills, water use, which would lead to higher water consumption overall. And also warmer summers will have a big impact on that too. So this is something we noticed from, say, last year. Our averages have gone up in terms of consumption, both for camping and non-camping festivals. And I think this is a trend will probably continue as you get sort of warmer summers. But in perspective, the average daily domestic water consumption is 144 liters. So as I think, if anyone went to the low emissions festival, if you're looking at sort of power consumption on average, going to a festival, you will consume less than if you were at home. This is in terms of power, if anyone's interested in power data. Again, when looking per person per day in terms of kilowatt hours, it was about 1 kilowatt hour per person per day, where we noticed mid-sized festivals tend to be quite, well, the ones we assessed anyway had sort of high efficiencies, particularly on their use of generators. Again, across the number of festivals we assessed, there was an overall reduction in the numbers of generators that were used. So we saw an increase in festivals that used grid connection battery sort of systems or hybrid systems, which is quite encouraging. And in terms of waste, about on average sort of half a kilo of waste per person per day. Camping festivals obviously having a lot more. And this is, we also saw an increase in the site recycling rate, which was really encouraging. Now that doesn't mean that everything you segregate on site will be recycled, but it means that there's a lot more work on site to try and separate waste streams and work sort of with your contractors, which is really encouraging. We also had a lot more events that we assessed that have banned single-use plastic, and particularly for traders, there's been a big uptake of sort of banning single-use compostable, single-use servewares, and sort of going towards compostable wood, paper-based. And as well, the average sort of waste per person per day, we've seen a decrease overall compared to the assessments last year to this year. So waste is a good result this year. I'm aware of time as well. I've been told it's very strict and no questions. But in terms of general highlights, I think we have seen across the board a good increase in transport data collection. So a lot of events are doing a lot of putting a really good effort into sort of capturing audience data in terms of transport and working with suppliers, freight, logistics, contractors, to get information on their vehicle movements, vehicle types, fuel consumption. That's something across board we've noticed that's been really, really good. As I mentioned, food and drink, there's a lot of work with traders, a lot of work with communicating the impact of food to audiences. Carbon labels is becoming a big thing, we've noticed. A lot more events sort of integrating those. And also sustainability communication to audiences, particularly sort of communicating what you're doing, communicating between shows, the messaging across sort of the design of festivals. We've seen a big growth in that and sort of how it's integrated with the design of the events. And yeah, site waste segregation seems to be a lot of work in really sort of designing in the waste infrastructure, making sure you have sort of correct recycling, clearly communicating, you know, recycling and waste streams. So that seems to have been, there's a lot of work on that across events. Where there's still a lot of work to do, procurement and materials data is something there's a big gap in terms of getting that information, both in terms of thinking of asking that information at design stage, as well as getting that information from suppliers and contractors. So quite often it's hard to get festivals and events to sort of correctly tell us how much they've bought in, what types of sort of materials they've bought in, and that includes merchandise and build construction materials. So that's still a bit of a data gap and a bit of a gray area at the moment. Artist engagement can be tricky. Some of the other sort of panels have mentioned that, but getting artists to engage in terms of green riders, in terms of you know, sustainable travel, in terms of food and drink, some artists, you know, getting, if you're telling them you've got a fully vegan, fully vegetarian festival, some artists are actually not too happy about that in some events as well. Renewable energy can be a barrier for some artists, might have in their specifications they want a certain baseline that they feel won't be available with renewables. That's happened in a few festivals where there's been, so for example, cycle power stages. We have the crowds and the sort of audiences that pedal, for example, to generate power, which is quite a good engagement and communication process. But some of them, you know, have artists who've come to play on that stage that they've had to sort of plug into generators because the artists would have seen that might affect their performance. So working with artist engagement has been there's still a lot of work there, I think. Something as well that, as I mentioned, site segregation on site is really good, but getting the information about what happens to the waste once it leaves your site is also still a bit of a challenge, and that's not necessarily the problem with the event organizers, but that's working with the waste contractors. So if you say that on site you've recycled 90%, you know, you've sent 90% of your waste on site to recycling, it might not actually be the case. Depending on where the recycling goes, it might actually end up being maybe a quarter of that might get incinerated, some might get recycled, some might get landfilled. So having that information from the waste facilities is a bit of a struggle still. And we worked with quite a lot of events that sort of hire venues, and that engagement at planning stage of making sure the venues know what data to give you, from energy, from waste to water, is still a bit tricky sometimes, especially if it's venues who are newer to sustainability. So there's a lot of work in terms of collaboration with getting them to understand what you're asking, what you want to capture, why, and making sure that they have the capacity to sort of provide you with that data. And that's been some of the issues with the assessment. We ask for this information on how much energy you use, how much water, and a lot of the struggles with that have not necessarily been from the organizers, but with the venues, for example, who cannot provide that yet. So that's still a bit of a challenge, getting all the different parties together. So this was a bit of a really brief, and yeah, remember to vote this year. But this is a brief overview of, I guess, the trends that we've seen from our assessments this year, from the festivals we've worked with. And based on the data we collect, we're hoping to get a bit more benchmarks going to be able to sort of get people to understand what maybe best practices in terms of sort of consumption, resource use per person per day. So we'll build that in hopefully sort of the coming years. I think I finished just on time, but is there any time for questions? No? Okay. But if anyone wants to ask, thank you.